Recording in progress.
Good morning, colleagues. A very good morning to you from the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. As we kick off the academic and technical part of the two-day consultation with the first session. This session will be on climate change and nutrition security, emerging challenges. We have with us today a very distinguished panel cutting across international boundaries, age, and so on, and areas of expertise. The session will be chaired by Dr. Venkateswarlu, former Vice-Chancellor of Marathwada Agriculture University, member of the Environment Ministry's task force, co-chair in fact of the DBT task force on Agri Biotechnology. He also has a distinguished record of working on issues of climate change and agriculture. He will be the speakers. We have a very fine lineup. Dr. Revati Phalkey, of the head of the Health and Climate Change Unit of Public Health England, was to deliver the lecture. She had prepared it, but called away on an urgent assignment. She requested, and the request was accepted by her eminent colleague, Professor Catherine Bowen, Deputy Director, MELB Climate Futures of the Law Division. She is also one of the lead authors in one of the chapters of Working Group 2 of the 6th Assessment Report of the IPCC, which will come out sometime early next year. So may we say we have two speakers, eminent speakers, for the price of one. It will be followed by Dr. Sylvia Karpagam, public health doctor, associated with the Right to Food and Right to Health campaigns, known for her clear critique of the socio-economic aspects and cultural aspects of food, nutrition, and diets. This will be followed by Dr. Sreeja Jaiswal, my colleague next to me, who is the project leader in the climate change group of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation here. This will be followed up by Ms. Julia Goette from the Agriculture Policy and Food and Nutrition Security. She is advisor in this to GIZ at the headquarters in Bonn in Germany. We are grateful to her for a bit. Perhaps we forced the pace at the last minute, but she very graciously agreed to be with us here today. So, friends, we have this eminent panel. I will not take more of your time. On our website, in the program schedule, we have a short session brief, and in any case, you will hear the speakers on the theme for yourself. Once again, we thank the speakers and our distinguished chair of this session, Professor Venkateswarlu, for accepting our invitation. I hand this session over now to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaraman. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, sir. You are.
Okay. Good morning to all of you, and Dr. Jayaraman, thank you very much for giving this opportunity to chair this very important session today in the morning. And of course, you have already given a little bit background about the the session and the speakers. Obviously, the climate change and the nutrition is very, very, in fact, as you said rightly in the preamble, this is one subject which has not been, really touched upon, although we did a lot of debates and dialogues on the impact of climate change per se on agriculture and health, etc. But the nutrition aspect really has not been touched. So I'm very, happy that you really brought this subject to the fore, and we will have very, learned speakers to share their ideas on this very important topic, and which will perhaps kick on a new debate on this very vital topic in our country. So with this brief introduction, may I now request so I hope, Dr. Jayaraman, you did brief them about the time management for the session as a whole, each speaker, how much time they get and all that.
Yes, but they have been briefed, sir.
Okay. So thank you in that case, and may I now call upon the first speaker. In Revati's case, I think her colleague will be speaking. So may I call her to give her lecture.
Thank you for that very warm welcome, Dr. Venkateswarlu, and also Dr. Jayamaran. It's my pleasure to provide this brief lecture to the MS Swaminathan Congress happening today. And what I will do is I will attempt to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Can someone tell me if that is working okay?
Yes, it is working. We can see it.
That's fine. That's fine, Catherine.
You can only see the slides. You can't see the presenter view?
Well, I see the presenter view.
I need to figure out how to...
Ma'am, you just click swap display.
The slides to show.
How's that?
Yeah, now that's done.
So you can't see the presenter view? Okay. It's all a bit of a learning process for us all, isn't it? So yes, as has been introduced, I will be presenting some background really on climate change, human health and nutrition. And so really I'll also be... I will be providing an overview of the main research so far, and I'll also be touching on, obviously, the pandemic that we're all living through at the moment. And I do want to acknowledge Dr. Revati Phalkey, who put together these slides and asked me quite late, given her travel requirements, to provide this lecture, which I'm very happy to do, but I have to acknowledge her work in putting the slides together. So firstly, you can see in this slide that hunger and nutrition is unfortunately on the rise globally. So according to the 2021 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, between 720 and 811 million people faced hunger in 2020. And this was an estimated 118 million additional people than in 2019. And the issue we have is that this, you can see in the image on there that actually it's the Zoom. I might just reduce this. That might be better. So you can see in that graph that there was a decline and then that plateaued off, but unfortunately it's increasing again. And there are estimates that around 660 million people may still face hunger in 2030. And this, as we know, is the deadline of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a massive problem that we have ahead of us. And much of this is due to the impact of COVID on food security. So in terms of our region, the Asia and Pacific region, the Food and Agriculture Organisation has put recent estimates of the number of undernourished people at 350 million. And so this number is very high and it's about half of the global total in this region here. So, and we know that Southern Asia has an enormous number of undernourished people, and it does unfortunately lead in this region in terms of the number of undernourished people. So in this slide, you can see the level of malnutrition in Asia and the Pacific. And what we've done here is we've highlighted India in black there. And so you can see that India has very high levels of child stunting and child wasting, and very low levels of children being overweight and adults being overweight. So unfortunately, we are off track to achieve the SDG of zero hunger by 2030. And I think we're all aware of some of the most pressing challenges ahead of us in order to progress to the SDG on zero hunger. They're listed here. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, is having a terrible toll on people all around the world, particularly in terms of access to food and water security. Climate variability and extremes, which I'll talk about in more detail. Also the issues of conflict and food security in relation to conflict, and the basic unaffordability of healthy diets in many places. So conflict and insecurity was a main driver of hunger and food crises in 2019, with over 135 million food insecure people in crises or worse across 55 high-risk countries and territories. And the World Food Programme estimates that this situation is likely to worsen given the socioeconomic and health impacts of the COVID pandemic. So we don't often talk a lot about the impact of conflict on food security. It's something that's receiving a little bit more attention now, but it really is an important factor that we must understand better in order to improve our food security and progress towards this SDG. So this is a good image, I think, to try and understand our progress to achieving the SDG 2 of zero hunger. So we can see that no country has achieved this SDG globally yet. Many countries have remaining challenges and significant challenges and major challenges in order to achieve this SDG. So it really is quite poor at a global level, and major challenges remain in India itself. And these sorts of images are updated very regularly. So this image, for example, was taken from the Sustainable Development Report, and we'll see a new image next year. So as I've indicated, COVID has reversed some of the gains. According to the Standing Together for Nutrition Consortium, COVID's impact on global nutrition is predicted to be worse than even the pessimistic scenario. So by 2020, there's projected to be an additional 13 million wasted children. So we really, and you can see this Standing Together for Nutrition image on the left of the slide here. They've indicated the additional impacts of COVID-19 on levels of malnutrition by 2022. Sorry, I said 2020, I think earlier. But this is really substantial. This is additional. We wouldn't necessarily have had this if it weren't for the pandemic. So when it comes to developing our strategies, it's really, really important to change, unfortunately, what our baseline understanding is on current levels of wasting and stunting and deaths, and also what these are projected to be. So we're having to redo all of the epidemiology behind this, given the pandemic. So I wanted to also highlight what the links are between climate change and human health and how food security comes into play. So this is a really helpful slide, I think. It's image. This really neatly spells out the links between changes in our climate. So as you can see up the top, we're seeing increased levels of carbon dioxide and other pollutants, along with impacting on rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and increasing extreme weather events. This is incredibly topical. I'm not sure whether you're all aware, but it is actually in about 3.5 hours' time when the Working Group 1 of the IPCC will release its report this evening, my time. So this is the report on the climate science. This will be released today. I encourage you to read through the summary for policymakers in particular, which is the briefest report as part of this Working Group 1's efforts. And it's really important to better understand what the climate science is so that we can then start to better predict what the impacts on human health will be. So as you can see there, there are a number of influencing components like demographic, socioeconomic, environmental and other factors that influence the climate change we're seeing and how it actually feeds into human health impacts and via the exposure pathways you can see there. And so food supply and safety is one of the really important exposure pathways that then impacts on human health outcomes. And you can see some examples of the outcomes here: undernutrition, salmonella, food poisoning and other foodborne diseases, and mycotoxin effects. So we know that climate change affects all 4 pillars of food security. And this is a lovely diagram that Revati put together to try and understand the systems that we really, really need to unpack in order to develop appropriate solutions. So this looks like quite a complicated image, but really what it's trying to demonstrate is that these things are all interlinked. And it won't be sufficient to just pluck out one of these issues, such as rate of child malnutrition, for example, without understanding what the household access to food is, what the rate of infectious diseases is in that community or in that household, what the food crop yields are like for that individual in that region, what the climate conditions are like, what are the projections for extreme weather events, for example. So really the purpose of this image is to highlight the importance of understanding food security as a systems issue. It cannot be viewed in isolation. And this is another way of looking at the systems-based approach of understanding the link between climate change, food systems, and nutrition and health. So this was some work that was done for the Adaptation Gaps report in 2018, and it was terrific to see that this Adaptation Gaps report for the first time had health as its focus and had a specific chapter on food security, which Revati and I co-authored. So this is just reiterating the importance of understanding these issues as interconnected, and we can't address the 4 components of food security: utilisation, stability, access and availability, without understanding the bigger picture. It will also drive the hidden hunger crises. So this is also, it's not just about quantity, it's about the quality. So it's also about the nutrients that are available in our food systems. So we know that an increasing amount of carbon dioxide will have an impact on the nutritional quality of food. This is a part of the research puzzle that we're developing now, and we're starting to better understand how elevated carbon dioxide levels impact on the nutritional quality of certain crops. So this is really an emerging area of interest for researchers and an emerging area of importance as well. So again, it's not just about the amount of food, but it's about the quality, the nutrients. And just showing this slide, apologies for its small nature, but again, it's from the UNEP Adaptation Gaps report. And what it's doing is what this table shows is what the projection is for additional burden for nutritional status because of climate change. So you can see, for example, that morbidity and so stunting is projected in 2030 to have an additional burden of 7.5 million children under 5 who will be stunted by 2030. So that's just to pick out one statistic from this table, but the point being that climate change will exacerbate our current already very fragile situation in terms of nutrition and food security across the globe. So what is a healthy, sustainable diet? I mean, this is one of my favourite meals. I've spent much time in India and it's a terrific, enjoyable meal. But healthy diets are out of reach for about 3 billion people. 3 billion people. And we know that this number is going to be made worse by the COVID pandemic and the economic impacts arising out of the COVID pandemic. And the exact makeup of a healthy diet varies. It varies depending on individual requirements and physical activity, the cultural context we're living in, local food availability and access, and dietary customs. But there are general principles for making healthy diets possible. And so a healthy diet ensures that we have an adequate energy and all essential nutrients. And it promotes all dimensions of individual health and prevents malnutrition in all of its forms and diet-related non-communicable diseases. And by that I mean stroke, hypertension, diabetes, and others. So we need to make sure, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, that our diet includes sufficient fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains and legumes. So I won't go into too much detail around that, but it really is just to remind us what a healthy, sustainable diet is. But importantly, consumers, so us, we need to make sure that we're informed in terms of decisions around a sustainable and healthy diet. We're empowered, we're supported, and we're willing to make healthy dietary choices when we have the opportunity to do so. So we also need to consider the bigger components of food security too in this process. So affordability is a really big issue in many places. You can see India has the black circle around it, and we can see that the cost of a healthy diet is much more than the cost of a nutritionally adequate diet or the cost of an energy sufficient diet. So putting those two together, the cost of a healthy diet is much more. So affordability is a major issue. And we can really be thankful for some of the advocacy work that groups like Standing Together for Nutrition have been doing. And how do we make sure that nutrition is something that's central to the COVID-19 recovery? And they've proposed that there are 5 urgent actions to protect children's right to nutrition in the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly looking at children. The first is to safeguard and promote access to nutritious, safe and affordable diets. The second is invest in improving maternal and child nutrition through pregnancy, infancy and early childhood. The third is to reactivate and scale up services for the early detection and treatment of child wasting. And we know how important that early detection and treatment is. Also, how do we maintain the provision of nutritious and safe school meals for vulnerable children? We know that children aren't attending school nearly as much as they were prior to the pandemic. And this has had impacts on the provision of nutritious and safe meals for children, where they used to perhaps really rely on that school service. And the final urgent action that's presented by Standing Together for Nutrition is to expand social protection to safeguard access to nutritious diets and essential services. And this is all possible. It might sound really ambitious, but we've seen governments in many places stand up to the challenge of COVID in terms of social safeguards, in terms of improving their policy so that that social issues are central to the COVID response. How do we make sure that this priority is continued beyond the pandemic? So in our recovery, how do we make nutrition central to the COVID-19 recovery? And so I probably won't go into this in too much detail because I realise that I've only got about a minute left, but I think I've explained in enough detail that there are 3 steps to really improving our diet quality. We need a healthy diet, we need to make sure our nutritional intake is also adequate, and that there's enough energy in our diet. As we say on this slide, there's still a lot on our plate that we need to really make urgent progress on. So there's a number of examples here on this slide. What about our enabling environments? Are there appropriate policies and structures in place to ensure that sustainable food systems are supported at a national level, at a subnational level, at a global level? How do we make sure that the COVID pandemic in particular is not going to exacerbate the inequities we're currently seeing across the globe, particularly in terms of food security? Prioritising mitigation. So we know that agriculture is a large contributor to our global greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, which is a short-lived climate pollutant. How do we push our policymakers to urgently reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at a national level? And then the final 3 are around improving climate efficiency, so especially reducing waste when it comes to the agriculture sector, scaling up interventions that are going to improve or lower the risk of climate-sensitive health outcomes, and develop climate-sensitive national dietary guidelines. So with that slide, I will finish up with just saying that 2021 is part of the United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition. We have the Conference of the Parties 26 climate change negotiations coming up in November this year, and it is really important that we strongly get food security on the agenda as part of those negotiations, and explaining that climate change will exacerbate current conditions of food security, particularly given the current pandemic and how that is also pushing people further back into food insecurity positions. So I will finish there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful lecture, and also keeping in time. And you really brought out, to the central focus, the nutrition, which is so vital for India, and the undernourishment, stunting, particularly in the context of COVID and its link to climate change. And your final message, that calling for climate-sensitive national dietary guidelines, I think is very important, and I think we would like to discuss further on this at the end of the session and come out with some specific takeaways from this session as a whole. So thank you once again. I may now call upon Madam Sylvia Karpagam to please deliver her lecture. Sylvia, please.
Just checking if my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me to this consultation, and my topic is on the socio-cultural dimensions of.
You should, Dr. Sylvia, just a second. You could go to slide view, and then we will see the full thing. It's at the bottom. Yes.
Yeah. Please press F5. Slideshow. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Click on that.
Yeah, okay.
Very good.
Now it's done.
Thank you.
So I think this the consultation has been located in the framework of the COVID pandemic. So in that context, I feel it's important that we are aware of a few things. I think the previous speaker did highlight some of them, and that is that the nutritional indicators and social security schemes in India were a cause of concern even before the pandemic. So it is not like things were extremely good and that the pandemic made it bad. It is that we expect in terms of nutrition and health that the situation was already a cause for concern, and this pandemic was probably aggravated it quite significantly. We also need to start thinking, I think the last wave we all know was very bad in terms of morbidity and mortality. Of course, we have to learn lessons from that in looking at interlinkages between public health, between education, between the livelihood and the socio-economic and cultural aspects, but also specifically look at nutrition and see if a better nourished population would have been able to handle the pandemic better. And just to give a snapshot of some of the indicators that are a cause of concern. So basically, we have the National Family Health Survey 5th round, which was in 2015, it was released. And we also have the Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey of 2017-18, which are our main sources of data in terms of nutrition. And as we can see, the stunting and underweight is quite a huge problem in the country. And the numbers here, numbers which are often quoted, are at -2 standard deviation. So if we actually look at a -1 standard deviation, which we should be actually, if we are looking at preventing a child from going into, severe under nutrition, we should be looking at the -1 standard deviation. The numbers are probably much more huge. We also have men and women with a body mass index of less than 18.5, which literally points to chronic hunger or almost a starvation situation. Parallelly, we also have men and women being overweight or obese. Again, anemia is a huge problem, ranging between 40 to about 57%. Right from children to pregnant and non-pregnant women and even men. And this is seen more in the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe populations of the country. So this gives a snapshot of the range of nutritional deficiencies. This is mainly done in children. So the study itself has broken it up into 3 categories, but I've just given a range so that I didn't want to go into the breakup of each group of children. As we can see, it's a huge problem. And I'd also want to flag that it's very rare for these deficiencies to occur in isolation. Most of it will be associated with other deficiencies, and therefore, even when we're considering solutions, we need to stop looking at nutritional deficiencies as isolated deficiencies. This again talks about the eating patterns and the diets among people in India. Very limited consumption of vitamin A rich foods, iron rich foods, eggs or flesh foods, and very few children have actually received adequately diverse diet from 4 or more food groups. And clearly there is an association between the wealth, household wealth, incomes, and maternal schooling. The diets of the mothers are very significant. And this is important because the problem is sometimes we tend to blame the communities that are facing the burden of these nutritional problems. It's not rare to hear people say that mothers don't care about their children, or women are getting married early, or women have large families. The burden or the onus of nutrition or health is placed often on people who are most vulnerable. So I think it's important to understand that there are multiple factors that affect people's access to health and nutrition. So again, I think there are some factors which affect nutritional status which are well known. Many of us talk about education, livelihood, occupation, geographic location. Like there's a difference between access to nutrition between urban and rural populations. Class plays a role. Gender, of course, plays a role. Religion can play a role in accessing nutrition. But we also need to acknowledge that there are several other aspects which affect the nutritional status. And one is this persistent projection of India as a vegetarian country, in spite of evidence showing that only 20% of Indians actually identify as vegetarians. And it's important to understand that those who identify as vegetarians because of their caste location also belong to a higher socioeconomic group, have better education, have better occupational status, and in terms of diversity, they probably have more access to more foods from more food groups. And also, ironically, they also consume animal source foods like milk and dairy products in quite in numbers that is important from a nutritional point of view, which probably explains why some of their nutritional status may be better. But then the kind of vegetarianism that is being promoted to the rest of the country is devoid of a lot of diversity. It's very cereal and millet centric. And this is reflected even in all the social schemes that the country has committed to. For example, we have the ICDS, which is for the preschool children. We have the midday meals for the older age children. We also have the public distribution systems, and most of them predominantly cereal and millets, maybe to some extent the small quantities of pulses and oils, but there is absolutely no inclusion of some of the other foods that actually traditionally consumed by people in their homes. And again, if you look at policies, I'll give a few examples briefly. It's basically framed from ideological or political or caste or religious perspective. And now there's a growing, location of this discussion on climate. Nutrition, in a way, gets sidelined and not foregrounded. And again, in India, there's a focus by the decision makers on single nutrient deficiency. So there is a talk about anemia, then they say we replace iron. But it's important to understand, like even in terms of anemia, it is not enough just to replace iron. You need multiple nutrients. You also need good quality proteins. For anemia, we talk about hemoglobin. The globin part is actually protein, and you need good quality protein to be able to make good hemoglobin. The problem with fortification is, again, it is very corporate centric, single nutrient focused. And if we're looking at it from a climate perspective, most of the premixes are flown in from other countries into India. We're not able to manufacture these locally. It takes away the agency of communities to produce their own foods. And again, the focus is on fortifying, for example, cereals, like you might fortify rice or you might fortify wheat. Again, putting the dependence on single food rather than talking about diversity or culture or food sovereignty. And again, fortification and climate change, I think that discussion also needs to be had. So I wanted to give an example of the midday meals scheme in India, where it was intended to provide one meal to the child, basically because of a number of children dropping out of school and to encourage them to attend school. The other was because of the nutritional issues that the country was facing, and Tamil Nadu has been a model that way in bringing out the midday meals. It has a huge impact on children. A lot of children actually come to the school hungry, and many of them are also anemic. It's very easy for children to be labeled as poor learners or slow learners, that they're not fit for learning. But most of the time the children are hungry. So the midday meal actually plays a very important role. And the idea of the midday meal was that it would be localized, in the sense it would be cooked at the kitchen, schools, in a school-based kitchen, by people who are from the community that the children are also from, which is mainly scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, OBC children who are attending government schools in India. It would be hot, and it would also be culturally relevant. Like, it would be what the children are used to eating at their own homes. But over time, what has been happening is that these school-based meals are becoming more and more centralized, and they are being handed over to organizations that come with a clear caste and religious agenda. So these little clippings that I put are actually from media headlines. There's been a lot of concern about the kind of indoctrination that is happening. Akshay Patra is actually organization that comes from the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So basically, they come in with the idea of sattvic food, tamasic food. They feel onion and garlic should not be used in the midday meals. And if you do a search, you will understand, the whole politics and ideology around this. And the children are receiving adequate foods. We also have a lot of taboos around serving eggs in the midday meals. We have two conflicting perspectives. So we have the National Institute of Nutrition, which says that good quality protein is derived from milk, fish, meat, poultry, and eggs. You also have the UNICEF saying be sure to include protein-rich foods. But then you also have organizations which are being given contracts for the midday meal saying eggs are bad for children, eggs are the menstrual discharge of the hen. It leads to increase in lust in the children, it reduces the concentration. So what I'm trying to say is you have two parallel frames of reference. You have what is so-called scientific or research frame, and then you also have the ideological or the political or the other frames, which we need to be cognizant of. We also have growing criminalization of meat eaters, specifically beef. I think it's become normalized. If someone is accused of eating beef, then it seems that it's okay to kill that person by a mob of people. So on the one hand, if we're talking about nutrition, and on the other hand, we're talking about culture or diversity, then we also need to have these conversations about who are being excluded by these kind of policies, especially from a nutrition perspective. Then this again comes from a larger culture of criminalizing meat eaters, which I think most of us know, and many of us enable in some ways, and we also participate in a lot of ways. We need to think through this. It's not about judgment, but if we're talking about nutrition, then we need to have these conversations. And the other factor that contributes to the nutritional crisis is, again, a lot of research that is coming in, which comes with predetermined bias, prejudice, again, ideological, and then the money is flowing into these kind of research, both national and international. You have media, and you have the doctors, academicians, researchers, teachers especially telling this to the children. So what kind of health education are we giving children? We really need to rethink that. We really need to revisit that. And conflict of interest is not disclosed very often. Recently there was a study that came out which said that the hemoglobin threshold to define anemia can be changed. This is an example of research which evolves from data. It's not validated by clinical evidence, and anemia has a lot of clinical consequences. So it's very important that any research also looks at the consequences of it. And this study actually looked at the CNNS data, what I had presented earlier, and they've tried to derive a cutoff for anemia. And basically what they're saying is that the numbers of anemia cases in India has been hyped. It's too much. Actually, the cutoff can be changed, which significantly reduces the prevalence of anemia in the country. But then again, if you look at cutoffs, you can't draw cutoffs from a population that is not in the best of health. And the CNNS data, if you look at the actual sample, most of them are from the lower socioeconomic group, and they're not, representative of a healthy population. So then we also have the Eat Lancet Commission, which is now, becoming the overarching influencer for food policy making. And if you look at the kind of representation on those commissions, it's not of farmers, it's not of, communities, it's not of the fisher community. It is of corporates and billionaires who are coming in and who are telling us that pushing a predominantly vegan or plant-based ideology. Again, they are talking about a planetary health diet, which is, nutritionally deficient, but it's also homogeneous. It kills, food sovereignty. And these are the, groups that are actually now leading the narrative on what food we should be eating. So these are some of the comments that people from the Eat Lancet have made. They said India is a model. So that is, these are the kind of comments they made. They say India can show the world how traditional diets can provide sustainable nutrition. And if this can happen in India, then it can happen in any part of the world. India is such a great example to show the world. I mean, India is being projected consistently as a model. And my question is, which part of this nutritional issue is a model? Is anemia the model, or is stunting, or is the B12 deficiency, or is, chronic hunger or starvation deaths? So I think we really need to see the ethics of promoting India as a model in terms of nutrition. And again, the things that we need to be cognizant of is that we can't have corporate interests riding on the back of climate change. So we really need to sift out the two. Is a discourse on climate change actually benefiting corporates? I think we seriously need to have those discussions. And is vegan or plant-based food the only solution, as it is being pushed by a lot of these commissions who have a lot of power in the sense they dictate almost what the government should be doing. They also taking major space at the UN Food Summit. The parallel groups that are opposing the UN Food Summit and also boycotting it because it is completely non-representative, it is not inclusive. And again, rather than looking at climate...
Dr. Sylvia?
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps you'll have to wind up now. I'm sorry, it's very
So I just give this last point that we need to look at what are the largest polluters, basically fossil fuels, transport, electricity, and we need to not put the burden of climate change on individuals and communities, especially the poorest people. Corporates and elites also should take control of their contribution to climate change, and consult with local communities, identify local solutions, bring in diversity, representation, especially at policy making. And also enable better access to animal foods, which are traditionally eaten by people in their own communities. Thank you.
Chair, we move on to the next speaker. Dr. Venkateswarlu. Maybe please check the connection if he's still connected. But in any case, I think in order to keep up the time, we will move ahead. May I just request the next speaker, Dr. Sreeja?
Yeah, Dr. Jayaraman, I am actually unmuted. So now, I was just saying, thanking Sylvia for a good lecture and inviting Sreeja for starting her lecture because we are running behind time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Is the slide up?
Sreeja, please.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the slide to go up. Yeah, all right. I'll be sort of centering the debate in a global perspective of climate change and diets. So the current narrative is that the global food systems is, and I'll explain subsequently why I've put global food systems in double quotes, is a major driver of climate change. And then there is the narrative that India, with its rising incomes and growing urban population, there is a shift in dietary preferences towards animal-based food, that is meat and dairy products. And this is going to be a major climate change concern in the future. And then there are recommendations of how, what can be the supply and demand side changes that can be made to mitigate climate change emissions from agriculture in India. And these supply side changes can be technological as well as management changes in management practices, ranging from energy use changes in irrigation to changes in genetic potential of animals and livestock. And demand side changes mostly relate to changes in dietary preferences and changes in bringing down food waste. And the narrative generally is that the food systems are responsible for around 34% of global climate change emissions. What I argue in this presentation is that this narrative relies on a very simplistic and universal framing of the problem in terms of global food systems, and that this debate is taking place without reference to several normative dimensions of climate change politics, including references to equity, fairness, justice, duties, and obligations. And that we need to root this debate within the backdrop of historical responsibility, equity, differentiation, and climate justice. I'll be making 4 major arguments in my presentation, starting with starting with looking more closely at the concept of global food systems. Then going on, I would be arguing that asking the developed countries to reduce emissions from agriculture is actually putting the burden of reducing emissions on those who are least responsible for. Is putting the burden of reducing emissions on those who are least responsible, who have the least contribution to climate change. Thirdly, I'll argue that there are problems with the suggested supply side measures because they ignore the regional differences in food production systems, as well as they are based on unrealistic models. And fourth, I'll be arguing that the suggested demand side measures ignores regional differences in consumption patterns. They ignore the food security concerns of developing countries. And third, they rely on uncoordinated consumer choice to solve what is essentially a global collective action problem. So, next slide, yeah. Previous slide, please. So moving on to my first argument, looking more closely at the global food systems emissions. And this is where the previous speaker just left off. So looking at, so in 2016, the total emissions in 2016 was 49.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the majority of this emissions, 72%, was from energy. Energy used in industry accounted for 24% of this emission, transport around 16%, and energy use in buildings around 17.5%. Agriculture, forestry, and land use as a total accounted for 18.4%. Within this, livestock accounted and manure together accounted for only 5.8%, and rice cultivation just 1.3%. If we look at, next slide, if we look at the sector-wise emissions from top 5 emitting countries, even then we see that electricity and heat generation, industry and transport together account for the maximum chunk of emissions from all these top 5 emitting countries. Agriculture, again, does not account for a major chunk of emissions from the top 5 emitting countries. Then, next slide. Then where does this narrative that the global food systems are responsible for 34% of the emissions comes from? This comes from the methodology that this narrative uses to account for emissions. Global food systems uses a life cycle method to account for emissions. So in the life cycle methods, both direct emissions and indirect emissions from agriculture are accounted for. So if you take the example of livestock, direct emissions, that is enteric fermentation, which is basically emissions from digestive systems of livestock, as well as manure management is accounted for, as well as indirect emissions from livestock. Indirect emissions from livestock is basically emissions from growing food and forage for livestock, and emissions in transport and processing of livestock products. These two together, this direct and indirect emissions from livestock is counted in the global food emission systems. However, in the IPCC methodology, only direct emissions from livestock is accounted for. Hence the difference between the emissions in these two methodology. If we see the IPCC methodology, livestock emissions only accounts for 5%. But if we go by the global food systems methodology, livestock accounts for around 14% of the emissions. The problem lies in the fact that there's no equivalent for other sectors of the economy. For example, there's no equivalent for global transport system emissions. That is, there's no equivalent emission calculation for, say, manufacturing of cars and then, say, disposal of cars. So this gives us a skewed picture of livestock emissions in the global food systems narrative. Moving on to my next argument. Next slide. My next argument is that the regional when we speak about global food systems emissions, we ignore the regional differences in historical and current emissions. Next slide. India's contributions to, if you look at, global warming is basically an outcome of the cumulative accumulation of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And looking at historical contributions, the US has contributed around 25% to the global cumulative emissions. EU, the 28 nations of the EU has together contributed 22%. China, 12.7%. India, only 3%. If we look at, next slide, if we look at India's per capita emissions, then India's per capita emissions is far below the world average. India's per capita agricultural emissions as well is far below the world average. Moreover, in the current climate change regime, developing countries are not bound to any sector-specific emission reductions. In the current climate change regime, every country has to put up voluntary emission reduction targets based on their national circumstances. India has already pledged to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 baseline. And it has already achieved a reduction of 24% of its GDP by 2016, according to its latest biennial update report. India is doing already doing much more than its fair share of climate change mitigation. And moreover, its voluntary targets have been deemed 2 degrees Celsius compatible and deemed to be more than its fair share of the global effort. Whereas the voluntary targets submitted by some other countries, such as developed countries, such as Germany, have been deemed to be highly insufficient. We have to keep in mind that developing countries have to balance their mitigation actions with their development concerns. Therefore, this implies that countries with historically low per capita emissions have room to grow their agricultural emissions to meet the food and nutrition concerns of their growing population and protecting the livelihoods of millions of small farmers, pastoralists, while reducing their overall emission intensity primarily from other sectors, namely energy and transport. Next slide. Moving on to my next argument of feasibility and problems with supply side measures. Next slide. So, in a paper, next slide. In a paper, Lee and others argue that some of these global modeled emission scenarios that it will limit emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius or well below 2 degrees Celsius rely on substantial reductions from agriculture. However, they put a carbon price on agriculture. And some of these models put a carbon price on agriculture to the tune of several hundred US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. Some of these models actually put about 100 US dollars to agricultural sector, carbon price of 100 US dollars to agricultural sector in developed countries by around 2030. But they argue that no country till now has put a carbon price on agriculture, and there's considerable reluctance to put any sort of carbon or any sort of climate policy on agriculture. Take the example of the latest EU Common Agricultural Policy, the 2023 and 2027. It has been criticized for not aligning EU farming to climate change goals. Moreover, there was a recent audit of the 100 billion of Common Agricultural Policy funds spent on climate action, and the EU auditors came to the conclusion that it had little impact on emissions. The authors also give the example of New Zealand. New Zealand in New Zealand, around 48% of the emissions come from agriculture, and it has one of the highest per capita emissions from agriculture in the world. It has around 9.8 tons per capita emissions from agriculture. However, it has tried and failed to apply any stringent climate policy to agriculture, mainly to protect its farmers and for reasons of competitiveness of its farming sector. Therefore, next slide. Therefore, they argue that if developed countries are finding it so difficult to apply climate policies to agriculture, developing countries are going to find it even more difficult because of concerns for food security and livelihoods. Therefore, a more realistic view is needed in order to prevent these climate models from giving an overly optimistic picture of climate change reductions, of emission reductions from agriculture. Also, many of these models, rather than taking food security concerns as a starting point, relegate these to further studies. Moreover, there's lack of sufficient attention attention among these models on different regional differences in agricultural production systems. I try to explain this with the help of cattle milk production systems across different countries. Here I have a graph of top cattle milk producing countries and milk animals. So EU as a whole produces the most amount of cattle milk, and between 1961 and 2017 we see that EU and US has managed to increase its milk production by reducing the number of animals. So if you see the EU, the number of animals has declined from 42 million to 23 million. That is a 45% decline. However, the milk production has increased from 116 million tons to 163 million tons. In China, China in the past 2 decades has invested heavily in modernization and industrialization of its dairy farms, and it has been producing the amount of around 31 million tons of milk in 2017, with half the number of animals that it used to produce approximately the same amount of milk in 2015. India, on the other hand, post-Operation Flood, though it has seen an increase in milk productivity, however, the increase in milk production has largely come from the increase in number of animals. India has seen a massive increase in number of animals from 18.2 million to 52.8 million. And the milk production has increased from 8.7 million to 89.8 million. So not surprisingly, next slide, milk productivity in US. Next slide.
Sreeja,
Yeah.
you have to wrap up now.
Okay. All right. Next slide. Yeah. In parallel, we see that the number of farms and the average size of farms, number of farms in the US and EU has declined substantially, whereas the average farm size has gone up. That is, the average herd size has gone up. So the average herd size in US has increased from 72 to around 160, whereas in India, we see that the number of dairy farms have gone up. Next slide. Number of dairy farms have gone up. However, the average herd size has remained around 2, which shows that the dairy farming in India has been is dominated by small farmers. Whereas in countries like US and China, there's been a move towards industrial farming with larger and larger herd size, and even and more farms with more than 1,000 dairy animals. Dairying in India is more of a low input and low output activity, and it is constrained by poor quality feed, which leads to low productivity and higher emissions. Next slide. Next slide. Therefore, coming to the feasibility of the suggested supply side measures, so the models, though they suggest that reducing agricultural emission intensity in developing countries by increasing productivity has synergies with food securities, on ground it remains very difficult. A number of these suggested measures, such as increasing the genetic potential of animals, improving the health of animals, remains very difficult to implement because of the lack of capacity and structural constraint that small farmers face. Moreover, there's lack of technical capacity and institutional structures to implement such measures. And dairy farming in India, also livestock rearing in India has multiple purpose. Unlike in the developed world where it is primarily grown for food, multiple purpose of livestock in India can range from family nutrition to use as drought power to transport and so on. And another point being, next slide. I'll just take 2 moments.
Summarize now. Please summarize the.
Okay. Okay. So in developed, next slide. In developed countries, the agriculture, including livestock sector, continues to receive enormous government support, and also the increase in milk productivity has generally been due to this enormous government support. If developing countries are expected to undertake mitigation, then from agriculture, then developed countries need to transfer technology and provide finance to developing countries. However, this also runs the risk of diverting climate finance to agricultural mitigation rather than adaptation. And I'll just end by making one point on the demand side of things. My previous speakers have already covered most of the points on nutrition. So next slide. No, sorry, previous slide. Yeah, here I have a chart on hidden hunger index and a relationship with a share of energy from cereals, roots, and tubers. So here, hidden hunger index is calculated as a measure of 3 deficiencies: prevalence of stunting, anemia, and vitamin A deficiency. So if we see that countries which have a higher share of energy from cereals, roots, and tubers have higher hunger index. So you see India right up there. Previous slide, yeah. You see India right up there. It has a higher hunger index because it has less food diversity, it has less quantity of meat and animal protein in its diet. And it is right up there with a number of African countries which also has higher quantity of cereals, roots, and tubers in its diet. Next slide. Also, the quantity of proteins in its diet, animal protein in its diet, is much lesser than other countries. So I'll end by saying that, last slide. Next slide. I'll end by saying that the messaging that avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to contribute to avoiding climate change is a very simplistic messaging, and what it does, it basically tries to find solutions to a global collective action problem through enlightened and uncoordinated consumer choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sreeja. I think that's a wonderful argument, and this is actually touching the central core of the theme. And we wish we had more time to listen to you. Unfortunately, we are running behind time around 11 to close by 11 or 11:05, 11:10. Is that possible? Or
Yes. I think we can take a few 5 or 10 minutes over time because in any case we are the first session, so we have to learning to get this on track. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, but we do have really wonderful speakers. Now, in that, then I would like to call upon Julia from GIZ to give her last presentation.
Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for your warm welcome. I hope you can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, my name is Julia Goette and I work as advisor for food and nutrition security at GIZ based in Bonn. GIZ is a German development agency and the implementation organization of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now I'm going to share my screen and hope this will work. So you should be able to see my presentation now. Okay. So I would like to start with a very recent example, which illustrates quite drastically the link between climate change and food and nutrition security. You may have heard of the flooding that occurred about a month ago in Germany, and actually quite close to Bonn, where I'm based at. And you can see the several linkages between the impact of this extreme weather event, that they are increasing under a changing climate. So for one, the food that was spoiled because just a layer of mud covered it, or it just has been washed away, or with a lack of electricity due to the power cuts, the fridges were not working, and so food was spoiled. But there was also impact on water that needs to be boiled now before drinking, so it's not safe anymore. And also the agricultural land, you see it on the picture on the right, it just has was swept away, so no land, no food. It also had an impact on infrastructure, as highways and bridges were damaged, so villages were isolated and could not be reached. And then with people having to flee their homes and had to crowd in other safe places, and then also a lot of people afterwards coming to help. Those crowds also facilitate the spread of the coronavirus. So this illustrates the several linkages that it has, and I think in Germany we're not that used to these natural disasters yet. I think Catherine and my previous speakers, they already very nicely, perfectly outlined the impact of climate change and nutrition on all the 4 dimensions of food and nutrition security. So I will go over it a little bit more quickly. But when you see availability, what you think of first are the declining yields, but there's also a loss in nutrients. So with the CO2 fertilization, the nutrient content of crops is decreasing, and this is an aspect which you need to bear in mind. That it's not only the decline in productivity and the yields, but also a decline in nutritional value of crops. And on the dimension of access, we already heard that 3 billion people cannot even afford a healthy diet. So there's the loss of income from a reduced production, and also the loss of income from climate change impacts has been quantified as for national economies and household budgets. In 2017, 153 billion hours of labor were lost because of heat, which is an increase of more than half since the 2000. And of course, there's also a lot of cost of the climate change, extreme weather events, with now the flooding, which has become quite expensive to rebuild. And on the side of utilization, well, we already heard that a good health is crucial for the body to be able to absorb the nutrients. And with climate change, we're expecting a spread of disease to increase. So already small changes in temperature and precipitation can result in large changes in the suitability for the transmission of important vector-borne but also waterborne diseases. So in 2016, for example, the global vectorial capacity for the transmission of the dengue fever virus was the highest on record. And this is also happening with the transmission of malaria and cholera that is also affected. And the heat stress, I mentioned above, the hours of labor that were lost due to heat, which does affect well-being. The water, both in quality and quantity, of course, as a basis for safe food preparation, it's also an important issue. Linked to it is also the food safety risk that I also mentioned before in the examples. Okay, so, well, you may recover from one extreme weather event, but then too many of them may cause a loss of livelihoods and productive resources, so it has an impact on the stability. So this was a short overview on the impact of climate change on nutrition, and it's more than yield. Health is also central to it. And so now we, as the implementation organization of the German Federal Ministry, the ministry strategy is guiding our activities, and there is a focus. So this means also adapting to a changing climate, but also mitigating the impact of the food system of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a strategic focus on agricultural research, for example, in breeding drought-resistant crops and climate-smart livestock systems. There's also focus on soil protection and rehabilitation, as it increases for soil fertility, which also then increases water storage capacity. It's a carbon sink, and it also contributes to increased resilience in face of severe rainfalls, for example. Then there's a comprehensive risk management, and this also includes agricultural insurance, climate risk analysis, and early warning systems. There's a focus on agroecological approaches to promote those synergies in resource use. There's a focus on water-saving cultivation systems, that try to adapt to the increasing water scarcity, both for water for irrigation, but also water for humans. And then also on diversification, both in crop and livestock diversity, but also in production methods. So with these topics overarching and guiding our activities, on the next slide I won't go too deep into that, but it's a food systems approach that we use to take into account interrelationships within the food system. And on the top left you see climate change is anchored within the drivers, within the environmental drivers. And we especially have a look at the key elements of the food system, which are food supply chains, the consumer behavior that then determine the diets and are interlinked with each other, and are especially important for the nutrition and health outcome. So we try to look first on the right side, look which nutrition and health outcomes do we want to achieve, so how does the other elements of the food systems need to be placed. So this is a adapted and a little bit more colorful version of the food systems framework from the HLPE report from last year. So you see there are many entry points of food and nutrition security. And next, now I'm going to briefly outline some examples from different countries. Climate change is a cross-cutting topic that has been mainstreamed into a variety of programs and activities. So the examples I will present now are equally diverse. So there's one from program level, but also two from activity level. So the first one is on diversification, both in climate resilient crops and production methods that then also contribute to or support dietary diversity. That's actually one of the key activities of our global program, Food and Nutrition Security, Enhanced Resilience. This example is from the community nutrition gardens in India. So the activities are that they are both use sustainable production methods. For example, also the intercropping of vegetables, which is not only good for soil but also for human health to increase dietary diversity. It raises awareness for local foods like dark green leafy vegetables, moringa, amaranth, and the training that is accompanied also addresses reducing post-harvest losses through processing to ensure year-round availability of nutritious food and also contribute to reducing waste. And this has been now piloted with about 20 gardens, and it's now in the phase of upscaling to 350 community nutrition gardens. The next one is more from the protection methods, the solar-powered irrigation that aims to alleviate the energy poverty and improve water management. We heard water is quite a key issue within agriculture in the face of climate change. So the irrigated land, we know that it's more productive. It can sometimes even provide an additional cropping season and provide a basis for more diverse production. And this program is aimed at the smallholders because those livelihoods depend on food and agriculture, but they are also among the most likely to experience hunger. And this approach has been also part of we contributed as a game changer in the solution cluster together with the International Initiative Water and Energy for Food at the UN Food System Summit that has been mentioned before. And there's another example of how to become more climate smart or climate smart irrigation method. The next one is to do with water as well. Here's more the water for humans. We saw now water for irrigation. This is water for humans. This is an example from Burkina Faso, where the lack of drinking water and especially a safe drinking water has been a problem, and they conducted a little study on how the use of powder of moringa seeds can actually contribute to or purify water, and not only the physicochemical but also the microbiological quality of water. And this is an environmentally friendly, very cheap and simple method to increase water quality which contributes then to a safe water. And we saw before that water is quite key, and it aims to then decrease diarrheal diseases and deficiency symptoms due to poor water quality. And besides also, the moringa trees used for dietary diversification, as it is a very nutritious crop, or very nutritious tree. So it addresses those both issues. And then this is just an example to show that we are also doing working on the policy level or commissioning studies. This one is we commissioned the International Food Policy Research Institute and the International Institute for Sustainable Development to inform our policy work. And the main question we posed was how can we influence, or how can policy influence consumption patterns that are better for environment and nutrition. So maybe if you have heard of the Service 2030 study, this is a deep dive because the previous study looked more at agricultural production, and here we wanted to include the nutrition aspects to generate those policy recommendations to drive consumption patterns. It was the question we had in mind is what are healthy and sustainable diets, and how do they look like on country and regional level? So this is a study in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Nigeria. And for now, diets are quite dominated by the cereals, grains, and starches, and the share of energy from fruit is rather low and highly seasonal. And here, of course, animal products play an important role because their consumption needs to increase in these countries. So there are opportunities for increasing the efficiency in livestock production and reducing food loss and waste. And preliminary results are showing that if you include healthy diets and not just agricultural production, this will double the cost for reaching SDG 2. And now that I also mentioned the importance of livestock, then the last example is from a program on climate smart livestock systems. because livestock is not only important for livelihoods, but also for nutrition. And then on the other side, well, there is, I wouldn't see it as a need, but then rather a potential to improve the efficiency of livestock production systems. So this program develops climate resilient, low emission approaches together with livestock farmers and tests them in practice. So these improvements may include in the cultivation of fodder crops, the preparation of fodder, in the manure and pasture management. And those results will then feed into farming practices, sector strategies, and investment projects. And there's also one part is also improving the reporting of the nationally determined contributions in the livestock sector. And I think as time's already up, I'll skip the last example, which is more from an urban development perspective and how architectural measures can contribute to mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And this gives you just a quick overview on some of the programs and activities I just presented, where they take place. They are part of the special initiative One World, No Hunger. And to conclude, I think my main point is here, that's why I included the food systems framework, that we need systems thinking. It has been mentioned before, you need to know your system. And in the case of climate change and nutrition, keep in mind that the challenges posed in nutrition by climate change are multidimensional. They affect all dimensions of food and nutrition security. And it's not all, it is about maintaining or increasing the efficiency in production and closing yield gaps, but there are also impact ways via health, infrastructure, water, food safety, and livelihoods. So thank you very much. That's it from my side so far. Thank you.
Chair, before we begin, just a very quick note from the organizers. We'll take the questions from the chat. So I think given the time limitations, we can have a maximum of 10 minutes and perhaps just one question per speaker, if there are that many questions. So over to you, Chair. We can't hear you, Dr. Venkateswarlu. Maybe you have to unmute yourself. Is he online?
I can see him.
Yes, so can I, but...
He's still muted, I think.
Yeah, you are you are muted, Dr. Venkateswarlu. You have to unmute. Ah, yes.
Nay, Jayaraman, the organizers are repeatedly muting me. I am unable to unmute.
Oh, okay.
So that's the problem.
Okay.
Anyway, I heard you about inviting questions, and let us have the questions first.
Okay. Unfortunately, Sreeja cannot see a question. Is there a question for Dr. Bowen? Can you see your chat, Dr. Bowen?
I'm just opening the... Is that question directed to me?
You, use your judgment, please. We are unable.
Yeah. That's. I think that the challenges of fortification were highlighted by one of my fellow speakers.
Yes.
I do think that. And would you prefer to? Sorry, I heard something just then.
Dr. Sylvia, is that question yours? Very quickly. Huh?
Yeah, thank you. I can answer that.
Yes.
Just in the interest of time, Catherine. So, I mean, basically, there are lots of things that are being explored. So we have biofortification of crops, and we also have fortification plans on large scale by the government. It's supported by the Food Safety Standards Authority of India. But the point is, I think what I presented is that there is very little diversity, and there is very little access to foods that people are traditionally eating. foods that people actually enjoy eating. Without looking at that, without ensuring that people have access to foods that they're already eating, I think these kind of discourses are only taking away from the issue of food diversity. Again, we don't want to increase consumption of cereals and millets at the cost of all other foods, because they also contribute quite significantly to the growing non-communicable diseases in the country. So, of course, the biofortification or fortification can be explored, but in terms of food and food diversity, I think it's important that we focus on animal source foods and specifically foods that are traditionally and culturally acceptable and enjoyed by people.
Okay, that's
if I
only,
may, Dr. Venkateswarlu, with your permission, I just want to direct one question, because I think policy-wise it is very relevant. And it's like a headline statement from our whole consultation. Dr. Catherine Bowen said very clearly, put food security at the center of COP26. So here at MSSRF, I think we are all agreed that this is a very important message that we would like to take up. So what are do you have any quick takes on that? What are the 2 or 3 things we should put up behind that slogan? Dr. Bowen.
Well, so I assume you're talking about the context of India for this example, and I think that what would be important is to provide the sort of data that we've seen in this session today in terms of how food security is worsening. So set out the problem. Food security is worsening. It's not projected to improve, and so we cannot at this point reach sustainable development goal around zero hunger, and then presenting some solutions. And I think a lot of I liked some of the examples that Julia shared with us in the session in terms of community-based nutritional programs, for example. And I know that there's a lot of that goes on in India. I've witnessed some of this in rural parts of India. I think you're really doing some terrific work in terms of empowering the communities around their own food security. But I think that generally, if we take a 3-pronged approach, so we lay out the problem, talk about it as an urgent issue and not projected to worsen, and then provide some solutions based on relevant activities in your own context, then that's something that policymakers can quickly look upon and see how that is. There should be a real opportunity for action. So I'm loath to present an exact sort of recipe of how to do that for the context of India, but I think that there's a wealth of, as we've heard from the speakers today, there's a wealth of knowledge and there's a wealth of experiences to draw on. So hopefully you can get the ear of your policymakers in the lead up to COP26. Often the policymakers, as you would know, sit in the Ministry of Environment. So it's also a matter of finding the right person through often personal channels, often our personal connections. Someone in rural development or rural water supply might have a lead into the Ministry of Environment, for example, to make sure that we can...
That, Dr. Bowen, we are not at a loss at MSSRF. We have very strong policy connections. I do so personally. So does Dr. Venkateswarlu, who was very much in charge of climate change and agriculture when he was in the system officially. So, but this message, I think, which you have given us, we will certainly do everything to take it forward. And I just want to say that Julia made a very important point about the cost of SDG 2. If you take everything into account, is actually, it will double the cost of SDG 2. there's a very important message that Dr. Sylvia gave about not stamping out diversity, of the continuing importance of flesh foods and egg and fish. Fisheries is, of course, going to be a big theme in this conference as a whole. Please listen to the next lecture. Sreeja made some other points about the importance of supply-side measures, focusing on the fact that livestock and agriculture is dominated by smallholders, so that's very important. So, but with your permission, Dr. Venkateswarlu, since we are running out of time, would you like to make a few remarks on the issues you have heard?
Sir,
and we'll wind up with that.
Sir, before that we have short questions. Shall we ask, sir?
Very short, because Dr. Venkateswarlu has to make some remarks also.
Okay, one from Dr. Anil Kumar. What is one critical recommendation for the Indian policy makers to reduce the child health insecurity?
So we'll take one question. So who would like to take it? What is the one sort of immediate recommendation for child food insecurity that you want to make?
I think Sreeja should be able to, because it's an Indian domestic issue.
I think maybe this also goes to Dr. Sylvia. Dr. Sylvia, you want to come in on that again? Dr. Sylvia, please. I hope we have not lost her. Anyway, Doctor, just before yes.
My power went off. Can I quickly answer that?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So I think if one had to make like one recommendation, I think India is not at the point of policy making; it's still at the point of decision making. I think for it to go into the stage of policy making, it has to be evidence-based, can be inclusive. So I think that can influence the kind of decisions that are being made. So I think actually using evidence, actually being inclusive, using recommendation, decision making would be very crucial for addressing even the climate issues in the country.
Inclusive decision making is your key recommendation. Okay. Thank you very much. Just a word before I hand over to Dr. Venkateswarlu to Julia. As part of GIZ, you must be aware perhaps that we have a lot of investment at the Swaminathan Research Foundation on nutrition gardens, homestead gardens. So this idea of community kitchen gardens is something that is actually being worked out in practice. So I'm sure we have room for further discussion on this. So we are running out of time. So Dr. Venkateswarlu, with your remarks, and then we can close the session. Over to you, sir.
I would like to just summarize in 2-3 important points. Number one point is that as far as India is concerned, the nutritional dogma, I think the biggest issue is the economic access. Once the economic access is resolved, in terms of providing more employment, all other our welfare schemes and all, certainly the availability is not the major issue as far as India is concerned for the poorer sections. Therefore, the focus, the last question you raised also, the focus should be on providing the economic access, enabling the communities to participate in the food systems with more economic empowerment. That is one thing. And second thing is the total food systems debate, as we see from the IPCC and all the recently you must have heard about Jeffrey Sachs speech on the food system summit. How eloquently he actually said how misplaced the priorities of the developed countries, taking the entire world along with their thinking. So my feeling is that the in this case about the food diversity, food systems, I think the developed countries have to unlearn and learn more from developing countries, particularly from India and China, in terms of diversity of food and the way the communities manage within their frugal resources, the kind of food security. And about the emphasis on the mitigation, which Sreeja very nicely said, I think we should not really bother about, or we should put less emphasis on mitigation and go for more for adaptation as far as agriculture is concerned in India. And the final comment is that, there should be some R&D issues also in this whole debate. In my view, the two R&D issues in this session, one is how does the climate change actually really impacts the food quality going forward. How does the mineral composition, food safety, food quality are impacted by the climate change? And second is how does the climate change, especially the heat stress and all the unfavorable situation on the agricultural laborers and the farmers who are working in the field, how does it impact their ability to absorb the food? These are two vital issues which I think nobody has paid any attention in terms of climate change and food security debate as a whole. So by and large, I think we are greatly enriched by all the four speakers with their arguments, and the debate as a whole has become very useful. And I would like to thank all the speakers and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. It has been a wonderful session for about 1.5 to 2 hours. Thank you, Dr. Jayaraman, for this opportunity, and thank you all the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all speakers on behalf of the... At 11:30, may I invite you to all of who are listening to the session to rejoin. We will be having the special lecture by this year's World Prize Food Prize winner, Dr. Shakuntala Thilstedt, who's a great expert on fisheries and brings a very important and, as was pointed out in this session, perhaps neglected sometimes dimension of food and nutrition security. So we invite you all to join us again at 11:30. With these words, we thank the staff and organizers who helped put the session together. Thank you all speakers. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all audience. Thank you.
Thank you.